It's kind of crazy how pandemic has just become like this everyday word now, right? It seems like every time we turn around, there's some new virus that everyone's freaking out about. And lately, it's been all this HMPV stuff, human metapneumovirus, especially with cases spiking in China. So for this deep dive, we're going to try to cut through all the noise and like figure out what's really going on with HMPV. Is this something we should actually be worried about, or is it just like a regular seasonal bug?
Yeah, that's a really good question to start with. I think the main thing to remember about HMPV is that even though it's been in the news a lot lately, it's actually not a new virus at all. It's been around for a long time, like decades. And chances are you've probably already had it, maybe even a few times without realizing it.
Oh, wow. Really? So then why is everyone making such a big deal about it now?
Well, the recent surge in cases, especially in China, has definitely caught people's attention. But honestly, it's probably just a seasonal thing. Like we see with the flu, HMPV tends to be more active in the late winter and early spring. And there are a few reasons why we might be seeing a spike right now.
Okay. That makes sense. I mean, it has been pretty cold in northern China lately. Could that be part of it?
Oh, absolutely. Weather plays a big role in how these viruses spread. When it's cold outside, people tend to spend more time indoors in closer contact with each other, which makes it easier for respiratory viruses to jump from person to person.
So it's not like some unusual outbreak. It's just HMPV doing what it normally does this time of year.
Exactly. And it's not just happening in China either. Other countries in the Northern Hemisphere, including the U.S., are seeing an uptick in HMPV activity too. It's all part of the natural ebb and flow of these respiratory viruses.
Okay. That is kind of reassuring. But here's what I don't get. If this virus has been around for so long, shouldn't most of us have some immunity to it by now? Like I read somewhere that almost every kid has had HMPV by the time they're 5 years old.
You're right. And that's actually really important because it means a big COVID-style pandemic from HMPV is extremely unlikely.
Okay. That's definitely good to hear. So basically, we're dealing with a virus that most of us have already seen, maybe even a bunch of times.
Yeah. And that's why it's important to make a distinction between a brand new virus that no one has any immunity to and a virus that we've been dealing with for a long time. Our immune systems have a history with HMPV, even if we didn't know it.
Okay. So we've established that HMPV isn't some new scary threat, and the spike we're seeing is probably just seasonal. But I mean, even though it's familiar, it's still spreading like crazy, right? I'm curious to learn more about how this whole pre-existing immunity thing actually works. Does it mean we're totally protected? Or could our past encounters with HMPV actually be helping us in some way?
That's where things get really interesting. There's a lot of research going on right now that suggests our experiences with common viruses like HMPV might be shaping our immune systems in some surprising ways.
Right.
It's almost like our immune system is a muscle that gets stronger every time it has to fight something off, even if it's just a cough or a sniffle.
Wow. That's so cool. So you're saying that even though getting sick isn't fun, those experiences are actually training our immune systems to be more adaptable and tougher.
Exactly. Think of your immune system like a giant library of defenses. Every time you come across a virus, your body adds a new book to that library explaining how to fight that specific threat. But what's amazing is that those books might not be just for that one virus. There's evidence that they could also help protect us from other similar viruses too.
So it's like our immune system is learning from every encounter and building up this awesome defense strategy over time.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole area of research so exciting. If we can figure out exactly how this cross protection works, it could have huge implications for developing new vaccines and treatments for all kinds of respiratory illnesses.
Wow, that's amazing. It totally changes how I think about viruses and immunity. Okay, I'm definitely hooked on this idea of the immune system being like a learning library. But before we go too deep into that, let's back up a little bit and talk about the basics. What does it actually feel like to have HMPV? I know we talked about symptoms briefly, but for anyone listening who's thinking, okay, but what if I actually catch this thing? What should they expect?
Sure. So for most healthy people, HMPV is going to feel pretty similar to a regular cold or a mild flu. You might have a cough, a runny nose, some congestion, a sore throat, maybe a fever. But these symptoms usually only last a few days, and you'll probably feel better with some rest and fluids.
So it sounds pretty manageable for most people, but I'm guessing there are some exceptions, right? We mentioned earlier that certain groups are more likely to have complications from HMPV.
Yeah, that's right. Young kids, especially those under two older folks, and anyone with a weaker immune system are definitely at higher risk of getting more seriously ill.
Okay, so for those folks, it's really important to be extra careful and get medical help if they start having any worrying symptoms. But what about everyone else? What can we do to protect ourselves and others during HMPV season? Especially since it's flu season, too.
Well, the good news is that a lot of the things we've all gotten used to doing during COVID are also really effective against HMPV and other respiratory bugs.
So, like washing our hands a lot, covering our coughs and sneezes, all that good stuff.
Exactly. Those simple habits can really make a difference in stopping the virus from spreading. And of course, if you're not feeling well, the best thing to do is stay home and rest. It might seem like a pain, but it's the most responsible way to protect other people, especially those who are more vulnerable.
That's a good point. It seems like we've covered a lot already. We've talked about the whole pandemic panic thing, explored this idea of pre existing immunity, and even touched on symptoms and prevention. But before we wrap up this first part of our HMPV deep dive, I want to go back to something we mentioned earlier. Are there any official health organizations that are keeping an eye on this and giving advice?
Absolutely. The World Health Organization, the WHO, is monitoring HMPV activity all over the world. And they haven't issued any warnings or anything, which tells us that what we're seeing now is probably within the normal range. Other health agencies like the UK Health and Security Agency have also reported more cases, but they're saying it's in line with what they expect for this time of year. So no major red flags from the officials yet. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. It sounds like the takeaway here is to be aware but not freaking out. We should definitely be mindful of HMPV and do what we can to protect ourselves and others, but there's no need to panic.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, the more we know about HMPV, the better equipped we'll be to handle this season and any other respiratory virus seasons that come our way.
Well said. And speaking of knowledge, I think this is a good place to take a break. We've laid the groundwork, debunked some myths, and even explored some really cool concepts about immunity. When we come back, let's dig deeper into the science behind how HMPV spreads and really unpack those fascinating implications of pre-existing immunity. Stay tuned.
I'm looking forward to it.
All right, we're back. So we know that HMPV isn't some brand new virus. It's been around the block a few times, but even those familiar faces can still surprise us, right? I'm ready to dive deeper into like the nitty-gritty of HMPV, how it spreads, what makes it tick, and all those fascinating implications of pre-existing immunity.
I like that you're thinking like a detective. And you're right. Even though we've known about HMPV for a while, there's still so much more to learn about how it works. Let's start with how it spreads. We touched on this before, but it's basically the same way as other common respiratory viruses.
So like being close to someone who's sick, touching stuff, they've touched the usual culprits.
Exactly. Think about it. Someone coughs next to you on the bus. You shake hands with a coworker who's sniffling. You grab a doorknob that someone with the virus just touched. Those are all perfect opportunities for HMPV to jump to a new host.
It's crazy how these tiny little things can cause so much trouble. But going back to that whole immune system as a library thing, it makes me wonder if those everyday ways of spreading germs could actually be part of what's building up our immunity.
You're on to something there. And you're probably right. By being exposed to these common viruses throughout our lives, our immune systems are constantly being challenged and updated. It's like a continuous training program for our defenses.
I love that analogy. So basically, even when we don't realize it, those everyday interactions, even the kind of germy ones, could be helping to shape our immune responses.
Exactly. It really shows how interconnected our bodies are with the world of microbes around us. We're always interacting with viruses and bacteria. And those interactions, even though they sometimes make us feel crummy, are actually really important for building a strong and flexible immune system.
That's actually a pretty cool way to look at it. It's not just about avoiding germs at all costs. It's about understanding how interacting with them can actually be good for us in the long run.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
Yeah.
We need to take reasonable precautions to protect ourselves, especially when these viruses are circulating. But we also shouldn't be afraid to live our lives.
That makes sense. It's all about finding that sweet spot between being cautious and understanding that viruses are just a part of life. Okay, so we've talked about how it spreads, but let's zoom in even closer. What actually happens when HMPV gets inside our bodies? How does it do its thing?
So once those HMPV particles get into your respiratory tract, they go straight for the cells that line your airways. The virus attaches to those cells and injects its genetic material. Basically, it's hijacking the cell's machinery to make more copies of itself. And then all those new virus particles burst out of the infected cell, ready to infect even more cells and keep spreading.
Wow, so it's like a tiny hostile takeover. No wonder we feel so awful when we're sick. But what's cool is that our immune system is usually right there, ready to fight back. What actually happens when our bodies detect HMPV? What kind of defenses do we have?
It's like a microscopic battle going on inside of you. And it's actually pretty amazing. When your immune system senses HMPV, it launches this multi-pronged attack. First, these special white blood cells called macrophages and neutrophils rush to the scene and start gobbling up and destroying the invading virus particles. Then your body starts producing antibodies, which are like these little guided missiles that target specific parts of the virus and mark them for destruction.
So it's like a whole coordinated defense system with different players working together to take down the threat.
Exactly. And this is where that pre-existing immunity we talked about comes in. If you've had HMPV before, your body already has a blueprint for how to fight it. It can recognize the virus quickly and launch a targeted and effective immune response.
So basically, our past experiences with the HMPV are giving us a head start in the fight.
That's a great way to think about it. It's like having a battle plan already in place before the enemy even shows up. Your immune system knows what to look for and how to react, which can really shorten the duration and severity of the infection.
Oh, that makes sense. But I have to ask, if our immune systems are so good at fighting off HMPV, why do we still get sick from it sometimes?
That's a great question. And it all comes down to how viruses evolve and adapt. Over time, HMPV, like many viruses, can change a little bit in its genetic code, which creates slightly different strains. And sometimes those changes can allow the virus to partially evade our existing immunity.
So it's like this constant game of cat and mouse with the virus trying to outsmart our defenses.
You got it. It's an evolutionary arms race. But here's the good news. Even if a new strain of HMPV manages to partially dodge our existing immunity, our immune systems are really adaptable. They can learn and update their defenses based on new encounters. It's like adding new information to that immune system library.
It's a constant process of learning and adaptation for both the virus and our immune systems.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to remember that immunity isn't like a switch. It's not either you have it or you don't. It's
Yeah.
more like a spectrum. Even if you do get sick from a new strain of HMPV, your previous exposure probably gives you some level of protection. So the illness will likely be milder and shorter than it would be for someone who's never encountered HMPV before.